Hello and welcome to the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I am your host, Jennifer. A lot has changed since I first started this podcast, so I thought I'd add a little to the initial introductions and provide something that's more up to date. I work with survivors of coercive control one-to-one. I also consult with families, and I offer education to the public around such topics. For the full scope of what I offer and also my credentials, you're welcome to check out my website, jennifer-french.com. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and as of August 2024, I've been accepted into a PhD program called Psychology, Policy, and Law, and I'll have a specialty in either criminal behavior or forensic victimology. This will support the work that I currently do as an expert witness in cases involving coercive control. The Project Hope podcast has provided such an amazing opportunity for me to meet many wonderful people, survivors, experts, family members, and it's truly a pleasure to meet each one of these individuals you will hear from. This podcast will conclude with Season 2 as I enter into my PhD program, but I have many other exciting things on the horizon, so please stay in touch and go to my website for any and all current events. Thanks to all of you who listen to Project Hope and care about this community. Hello, friends. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to this very first episode of the Project Hope podcast. Before I dive in, I just wanted to share with you all that these first two episodes will actually have a different style or kind of flavor to them due to the fact that I'm sharing my personal story. And I really felt that in order to share the details that might provide the most value to you, writing my thoughts and then reading them would ensure that I don't miss elements that could be helpful. So I hope it's not too distracting that I'm reading my story, and you can expect that future episodes will be conducted differently. This is a passion project created by me, your host, Jennifer. My company's Jennifer French. I created this podcast for individuals that have a loved one in a group of high demand or high control. And as someone who was in such a group myself for 11 years, I needed to go through a serious period of reconciliation and healing with family and friends. It was devastating to me to really receive the stories of sorrow and desperation that my family endured during the time that I was in this group. I've now been out for 8 years and have become particularly interested in how we can help and support those who I kind of see a little bit as on the outskirts. So the family members and friends who have loved ones that are involved in these groups. So in the podcast, we're going to share stories from those who've left such groups, as well as their family members' stories. And we'll explore topics such as what can be done if a loved one is in such a group. We'll also dive into understanding some of the principles within these group dynamics that hopefully provides you with some valuable information in understanding what your loved one might be experiencing. So as mentioned before in these first two episodes, I thought it only fair that I share my stories with you in mind. So the first episode is the story of how I got involved with the Order of Christ Sophia and what transpired with my family as I got deeper in. The second episode is the story of events that took place leading to my leaving the organization. So it's my hope that these stories, along with each episode of the podcast, might provide a glimmer of hope for those that have loved ones in a similar situation, And maybe there's a single nugget that could provide a new insight, a new possibility, a new perspective that might bring you hope and also hopefully aid you in reuniting and healing with your person. So I may not know you, but my heart is really with you all. So I'd love to hear from you and receive requests on topics of interest that might be helpful to you. It's really my hope that this serves you all as an audience. Also, if you would like to share your story, maybe you're somebody who has been in such an organization and has left, or possibly you are a family member who would like to share their story. I know that that's very sensitive, especially if you still have a loved one in a group, but my hope is really to share these stories because I think it's so important for those who are going through this experience to really have some sort of support system. And I know that that's been really helpful to a lot of family members or friends who are struggling in this way. So you are welcome to email me at projecthope@jennifer-french.com. For podcast episodes or any updates, you can always go to my website, jennifer-french.com/Project Hope. And these links can also be found in the podcast information below. So here is the story of how I joined the Order of Christ Sophia, the OCS for short, also known as the Centers of Light. And for privacy matters, certain individuals are referred to with an initial. In 2001, I had moved to Boston for a very exciting opportunity to apprentice with a well-known home birth midwife named N. I was 26 years old, a few years out of college, and felt like I had found my calling in this profession. I had already been in school training to become a midwife for a year and a half when this opportunity emerged, and I was more than happy to move to Boston and fulfill the experiential requirements for my degree. My mother and father came up from New York City to help move me into my little studio apartment on Boylston Street. I was thrilled, inspired, a little nervous, but mostly up for the adventure. At my very first home birth with N, I met another woman, R, who had trained with N and was now assisting her as a fully certified professional midwife herself. The birth turned out to be a long labor, and we all took turns getting rest and then tending to the couple. R and I hit it off right from the beginning. As we spoke to one another across the bed, we shared in real and deep ways and ended up chatting all night about spiritual topics and personal stories. By the end of the evening, she had invited me to a seminar on Mother Mary, the Mother of Jesus. I said yes right away. Not only was I excited to meet someone who might become a friend, since I hadn't made any friends in Boston yet, but I was also very curious to learn more about Mary. The seminar took place on a Saturday. I knew that R wasn't going to be there, so I rode public transportation out to Newton, expecting to show up at a lecture hall where I could quietly disappear in the crowd, sit back, and take in a lesson about Mother Mary. As I approached the location, I realized that I was walking into a large, beautiful New England home. I thought, this is a bit odd and not what I expected. But as I approached, any hesitation disappeared as I was warmly greeted by a beautiful woman in her late 50s named B. She knew my name and approached me with arms wide open. I loved her immediately. She felt warm, joyful, light, and wise. She kindly ushered me into the chapel where the lecture would take place. At the front of the room, sitting on a raised platform, I saw a man and a woman, both wearing traditional priest garb. They were clothed in all black with a priest collar, wearing a large silver cross hanging from a royal blue ribbon. I was told these priests were Peter Bowes and Claire Watts. The format of the day began with the Mother Mary lecture, and questions or interruptions seemed welcomed. Immediately, I was struck by how real everyone seemed. People were asking personal questions, and not just personal, but questions that revealed their inner thoughts or doubts, questions that were deep and thoughtful about the spiritual, about life. I reveled in the questioning and introspection. I felt home. Two very significant things happened for me during that initial introduction to the Order of Christ Sophia. The first was that I decided that in the energy of these two wise people who seemed so loving, clear, intelligent, and open, I would ask a question. As they encouraged others to ask questions and explore the meaning of life, I began to feel inspired and comfortable, as though I was with my people. So I asked a question that was extremely personal, on a topic that had brought me deep pain. I was brave enough to execute on a little vulnerability, and yet not quite comfortable enough that I wanted them or the room filled with about 30 people to know that I was asking for myself. So I told them I was asking for a friend. Peter took my question. As he gazed directly into my eyes, I felt my soul pierced. He spoke very directly and specifically to me, addressing my deepest fears and concerns about this topic. He provided me with insight and a path out of the pain with the most tender and caring demeanor. In this first moment of real connection with him, I felt more seen and loved than I had ever experienced with a stranger in my life. He struck a chord inside my knowing, and I felt washed, cleansed in truth. The second event that took place was what they called a blessing group. We counted off into small groups, and Claire took the group that I was in. She explained that one person would ask for a blessing on something in their lives that could be personal or for someone else. New people were encouraged to ask for something personal, though, so they could have the full experience. The one being blessed would sit on a chair with everyone else around them. They would ask for what they wanted, and then people would gather around and lay their hands on that person in the chair. The ones laying on hands would open to the request, let the Spirit move through them into their hands, into this person. All this while Claire prayed out loud. The closure of the prayer would be our signal to remove our hands, and if the person receiving the blessing wanted to share their experience, they would. Otherwise, they could remain silent and simply receive from the others what their experiences were. My first thought to all of this was, hell no, I'm not having some people I don't even know lay their hands on me and put energy into my body. Oh, hell no. Then, one of the women in the group sat on the chair and asked for a blessing on her marriage. She and her husband were struggling. As the prayer began, I felt so much emotion. Such care and love emerged from my heart for this couple who I didn't even know. I felt connected, in compassion, and centered. My experience began to shift, and I felt as though I could actually visualize the husband sitting right in front of the woman. I saw this light begin to emerge, and it fell into a beautiful figure 8 pattern of exchange, moving between the solar plexus of this woman and her husband. It was simple and real. I didn't question it. I didn't control it. I knew what I had seen. And anyhow, I had no plans on sharing my experience with these people out of fear that I might seem a bit weird. The woman in the chair was the first to share. She was direct and balanced in sharing her experience. She had felt a lot of love and support and had seen her husband sitting in front of her and a figure 8 energy moving between the two of them. I was and wasn't surprised. It made sense to me that I had connected into something that was for her, and I supposed that my genuine care had opened this channel. The new and significant shift for me was that it felt like a sign. I had always had a relationship with God. I had had spiritual experiences before, but why had God given me this super connected experience with these people? They felt like my heart family, my spiritual tribe. It was almost like I loved them already, and I didn't even know them. That day, I signed up for my 6-week Introduction to Christian Mysticism course, and I was in love. I began showing up for morning communion to begin my day. I was inspired by all I was learning about the esoteric and how to apply that to my life, to better myself, to deepen my relationship with God, to get to know and understand Jesus and Mary, respected equally in this organization. These teachings felt both progressive, deep, and ancient all at once. I loved this world of traditional Catholic rituals and principles explained in a new and transformational way. For example, with communion, I learned that receiving the communion bread, also known as the body of Christ, could result in an energetic removal of my sins or misgivings or wrongs, and I could actually open my heart and mind and being to having these negative things lifted. With the wine or the blood of Christ, it was believed that during this ritual, the priest would be the vehicle by which the Holy Spirit would transmute the wine into the blood of Christ. In other words, the red blood cells carrying the life experience of Jesus, his light, his love, and energy. I could open to take this in, to replace what I had just given over, and every time I felt renewed and connected to myself, to God, Jesus, and Mary. I was beginning to have experiences where I could feel Jesus's energy, and he felt very different to me than Mary. I treasured the 30 minutes before communion when we meditated, as I was just beginning to have profound and personal experiences. I was coming alive in ways I had only experienced for short, contained moments in the past. I was feeling more peace, in love, seeing things in new ways, with new perspective.
Now here's a word from our sponsor.
I am delighted to offer you Pure Haven products. All proceeds received go right back to the Project Hope podcast. I myself have been using these pure, safe, and toxin-free products for over 4 years, and I absolutely love knowing that my home has countertops that my little niece and nephew can eat off of without worrying that they have a handful of chemicals being placed in their mouths. The cleaning products are some of my favorites. The glass and surface cleaners smell amazing as well. So if this is of interest to you, please go to purehaven.com/Jennifer French. The link is also included below with information about this podcast segment.
Now back to the pod.
Very quickly, I realized that the house we had all been at for the seminar was called a novice house, and I wanted to be a part of it. B, who had greeted me at the door, was the female priest that lived in the house. R, who I had met that first night at a birth, also lived in the novice house. There were female deacons living there as well. The other 4 to 5 women were around my age and were called novices. This was the intensive track, where you could live with ministers along with your novice sisters and take the 2 most serious vows available to a non-minister. The first was that we were to commit to a year-long vow of celibacy. I was all in. Other expectations included being at meditation and communion every morning at 6 a.m. with other community members who wanted to show up. If we had time before work, we would have breakfast at the house with other novices and community members. We were then expected to all have dinners together, to attend our Bible contemplation classes every Tuesday night and our mystical Christian class every Thursday night. We attended Sunday services every weekend, along with a community lunch that happened with everyone. We were expected to spend the seminar weekends at our center, which took place once a month for a long weekend, with a teacher, either Peter or Claire. Every night at 9, we had evening prayers in the chapel, and anyone from the community could join that as well. But the duty I adored the most was having a daily spiritual exercise. I recorded these experiences diligently and reported them to my teacher in my journal, where everything was recorded and revealed. I was coming alive and awakening to the world of spirit. I really wanted to get to know myself and understand some of these deeper qualities of life. The second vow we were expected to take as novices was that involving the relationship between student and teacher. During my novice ceremony, I would take a vow of obedience to the teacher I was given. On February 6, 2002, just 4 months after my first Mother Mary workshop and 1 month prior to taking my novice vows, I would write in my journal, quote, "I need to meditate about the obedience vow. I want to be able to be sincere in my vows, and this one doesn't feel right. It feels like I'm so willing to give myself over, trust in my teachers and God's guidance, but free will is all I have left. I feel that in a vow of obedience, I am promising to do as told, therefore losing my right of choice. Please, God, help me to gain more clarity. I just feel a bit scared about change today." End quote. Our discussions, whether over a meal or just mingling after services, were personal and deep. I was feeling very connected to everyone who was a regular. There were families with children, couples, and singles. I was thrilled with the ways my life was changing, and I was feeling alive and aligned. But even around this time that I was moving in, the theme that would unfold and become my biggest area of transformational stubbornness, according to the teachers, was already beginning to emerge. That of familial attachment. In my particular situation, I come from a family that was extremely close. I grew up internationally, mostly in my younger years, and my mother always said that she thought my brother Hanley and I were so close because we had to be one another's friend through these times. But actually, as I progressed in years, I would come to conclude that I just got really, really lucky. I know that many siblings spend a lot of time within the family unit but are not very close. My present reflection is that my bro and I have just always been simply simpatico. While different in many ways, we always just fit well together. We had similar likes and dislikes, similar propensities towards sports, travels, and adventures, and frankly, we just connected and communicated well with one another. Mostly it was us scheming against our folks. Being 2.5 years older, I shared most things with Hanley. He knew how I felt about family dynamics that were happening. He knew about a lot of my friend drama, And by the time I was a junior in high school, my friends and I were slowly including Hanley and his friends into some of our activities. I adored my mom and dad. I had very special relationships with each of them. I shared everything with my mom. She knew about all my big and small female moments, like when I was thinking about losing my virginity or wondering how to navigate something within my friend group. I would ask her for advice or help without hesitation. My father was the parent whose respect I would yearn for. As a child, I would consume his stories voraciously and wanted to know all about what he was like as a teen, what naughty things he did with his friends. As a little family unit of 4, it was silently understood that I was a little more like my dad and Hanley was a little more like my mom. But there was so much care present between us all that I believe both Hanley and I felt special in our own ways. My parents always hugged and kissed us, and I knew I was loved, but they said it anyway. So in those first months of becoming a novice, I was already feeling a pressure to choose God and my spiritual family over my biological family. It's hard for me to recall exactly how much pressure was on me within those first months, but I know that the pressure was enough that I went back and forth with my family about possibly staying in Boston for Christmas Eve service. The purpose of this was to be with my spiritual family, a term which was already creating a subtle division between the spiritual, elevated humans on the planet that cared about God versus people in the world that we would come to see as less evolved and therefore less than. At least if I could be with my novice sisters on the most holy of holidays for just part of it, then I wouldn't miss out on a spiritually deepening event, and I wouldn't miss out on being at least partly good in the eyes of my teachers. So it was the following year when I called my mom and dad to let them know that I wouldn't be home for Christmas for the first time in my life, that they were shocked, to say the least. I knew this would be my big moment of independence. The teachers, Peter and Claire, as well as B, under the direction of Peter and Claire, had made it very clear to me that as a novice, Christmas was the event I needed to be at. And if I were to decide to return home to my parents' house, I would be choosing my bio family over not just my spiritual deepening, but God's will for me. It had been just a year since I had taken my novice vows, and it was clearly time for me to align with my spiritually awakened self and make a decision that held a weight of proof of my devotion to God. I spent hours and hours each day over the course of many days in our chapel, on my knees, in tortured prayer, trying to get clear about this decision. Each tear that fell seemed to sever my heart open. I so wanted to be with both families. I was devastatingly torn. I knew that the holy and correct decision would be to choose God, but I could barely do it. I didn't want to hurt my family, and I also didn't want them to worry based on how odd this choice would seem to them. It was horrible. My teacher said that I needed to meditate on and receive my own answer about the decision, but I was swirling in all the feelings and sadness, knowing how hurt my family would be. My intuition about how important this decision would turn out to be correct. Not so much because God would care, but because it would be the landmark of the first major fissure that would be inserted into my relationship with my family. To complicate this, in that first year with the OCS, a report came out about the OCS being a cult. Peter and Claire spoke very openly with us about this and educated us on how to think about these accusations, why they were incorrect, and how to respond if anyone questioned. We went through a checklist that could be found online regarding what makes an organization a cult. With our tutorial directly from Peter and Claire, we were all clear on why it wasn't one. We then had a very dramatic incident transpire with one of my novice sisters. She had returned home to her family for a weekend and was supposed to be back at the novice house on a Monday. I was home with a deacon when she showed up with a friend of hers from high school. They went upstairs to the room we shared, packed up all of her things, and left. She wouldn't speak to me. I was very shaken by this. I felt scared, and the incident played into my secret fears that we might be a cult. We then learned that this sister had experienced an intervention when she had returned home. Her leaving and the way that she did it was directed by cult experts and the care of her parents. Not only was I devastated at the idea that I would never see this friend again, but deep within me, I registered that if her parents had gone to such an extreme, it was likely that my parents, too, were speaking to cult experts. This infuriated me. I felt betrayed and concerned that my freedom would be stripped by my parents as they were being influenced by these cult experts. The tone of our conversations were changing. My parents began involving my aunt and uncle, who were spiritual confidants of mine. They too seemed to think I was in a cult. I was desperate for everyone to understand, and I clearly wasn't doing a very good job explaining these spiritual truths and principles and the extraordinary beauty of this spiritual path. So the next best step unfolded, and I invited my parents to come to the novice house and have a chat with B and R present. Here, they could ask all questions, challenge all perspectives, and finally understand. But that wasn't the takeaway. While I recall the interaction being balanced and fine, I would spend another year diligently trying to convince my parents that what I was doing was good, that I was safe, and that I loved what I was learning. But with each conversation, it seemed that my parents were progressively speaking someone else's voice, and I knew they were in discussions with cult experts who were coaching them. I felt more and more like I couldn't get through to them. Trying to convince them was becoming exhausting, and worrying about them being hurt by me was a burden I was struggling to carry. Sometime in that second year as a novice, I was given permission to go to a birth center in El Paso, Texas, in order to get in some of my midwifery numbers. As a part of the training, one must have certain experiences before becoming certified. At the birth center, they had a training program designed for high-volume clinical work. I was able to see a lot of women in just a few weeks and also experience the management of complications during childbirth. I was in my element. It was such an exciting time. During my stint in El Paso, I met an incredible midwife. Although the age of my mother, she was a kindred spirit, and I loved her immediately. As we got to know one another, she proposed that I move to California to work with her. It was a dream come true. Upon returning home, I negotiated with the teachers. We had a Center of Light in Oakland, California. What if I entered that novice program, lived in the center, and commuted to Santa Rosa? The commute would be 1.5 to 2 hours, depending on when I traveled, but it was worth it. The teachers agreed, and the midwife was also fine with the arrangement. This began my few-year stint in Oakland. During these years, there were 3 very significant things that happened with my family. The first was that my family wanted to come out and do a little trip together. This topic was becoming a great source of shame for me. The message from Peter and Claire was that I was too attached to my family and that I cared too much what they thought. They harped on my emotional attachment, and I knew that if I kept wanting to be in touch with my parents, I wouldn't be seen as evolved enough to be in training to become a deacon. This was the golden carrot that I so badly wanted. I was quite clear from the beginning that I wanted to serve and become a deacon and then priest one day. All of this was determined by Peter and Claire, and we could make it known that we wanted to serve, but they would determine if we were spiritually evolved enough to move into that next level of service. I had resisted cutting off complete communication with my family. This had never been my way. I had always been a communicator, and even within my family unit had been the one to discuss difficult things. I couldn't comprehend why I would cut off communication when it seemed to actually be the path to heal, to understand and connect with others. In fact, in our centers of light, amidst members, there existed a very heavy emphasis on communication skills. As novices, we were taught active listening. When we had something that bothered us, we were expected to process that with one another, often with a minister guiding the process. Particularly for those on the ministerial path, we practiced imago therapy and active listening, working with our students and couples, so everyone in the community was quite skilled at working things out. We revealed all feelings and resolved conflicts. This created very close and intimate relationships. We were extremely vulnerable with one another. If all of this communication was drawing me deeply into knowing myself and others, why then would I shut this door to my family? I knew I was pushing the boundaries, but I took a stand and told my parents to come to California. I was hopeful yet again that I'd be able to convince them that all was well, that they would see the positive changes in me and their worries would be assuaged. The four of us were together again, and we drove up to Santa Rosa. The days unfolded with many discussions about the OCS. My family asked many questions as I tried to answer to the best of my ability, again attempting to make them understand. I felt very shut down to my family and their input. It was a very difficult and challenging trip for me. When we met up with the midwife I was working with, I could feel the desperation in my parents, wanting her to know I was in a cult so that someone was looking out for me. On our final day together, we arrived at the airport to send them off. I remember hugging my dad. I remember the desperation and hope in his voice as he asked me if we could see one another again. I said yes. He asked me to promise. I promised, and I meant it. We cried, and I felt the warmth I had always known in his embrace. Then I returned home, a home where Peter also lived when he wasn't traveling for a workshop at another center. I can no longer recall the exact conversation with Peter as I relayed my experience with my family, but by the time my family arrived home, I was clear and aligned with my spiritual teacher once again. I called them and told them that I would not be committing to seeing them again. Incident number 2. Many months later, my brother called me and told me that he was coming to the area to see one of his best friends, and he'd like to see me while there. He requested that we do a day trip together and head down to Carmel. I agreed, and the day arrived. We strolled the streets of this charming little town. We walked to the water. We sat outside and had lunch. We did speak about our mom and dad. I expressed how I felt betrayed and controlled by them, that I just couldn't seem to convince them that I was okay. He didn't push me or debate any of my points, and I felt close to him. When he shared with me about the home that my parents were building in Florida, I felt a private pang of missing them, of missing out on all that my family was creating. The sun began to set, and it was time for our dinner reservation. All of a sudden, my aunt showed up. This was my auntie that I had a very deep relationship with. I had grown up with her just one town away, and I confided in her and my uncle about things that were painful. We also had a spiritual relationship, and I would sometimes go to church with her and my uncle and cousins. Upon seeing her, I felt panic, suspicion, and actually violated. I said so. I told them that I felt ambushed and it didn't feel good. But we managed to talk it through, and I quickly began to feel much better. As the evening progressed, I was becoming aware of a dissonance inside of me. I was considering all that Peter had said to me about my family, how unevolved they obviously were, but for some reason, this didn't seem very important in the moment, and in fact, I was aware that I really loved these people. I missed them. My aunt shared very deeply about a really sad incident that had happened. I had missed these events, and I felt heartbroken. I wondered if I could have made a difference had I been around. I swallowed these feelings and maintained my balanced facade, expressing compassion, but not too much. During our drive back, I asked if they wanted to come to Sunday service the next morning, and they gladly accepted the invite. I felt a glimmer of hope and a balm upon my heart that I had had such a good day with my brother, and that everything had turned out well after the bumpy start with my aunt. I had held my power in addressing what hadn't felt good, so Peter would be proud, but most importantly, there was a genuine connection, and Hanley and my aunt were obviously not as judgmental about what I was doing because they were open to coming to service. Perhaps they weren't as unevolved as Peter had made my family out to be. Hanley and my aunt would experience a service and would surely enjoy it and realize I wasn't in a cult. This was my beacon of hope, that it wouldn't be forever that I wouldn't see my parents. All I needed was for some family members to understand, and eventually my mom and dad would get it. It was my secret sign that all of this was temporary, and in time we would be back together again. We said goodnight, and I expected to see them the next morning. Upon my arrival home, I detected feeling a little hesitant to share with Peter about the trip. It began to dawn on me that he would not react well to the ambush part of the day. I was correct. He was in disbelief at my ignorance and questioned how I would allow myself to be put in that position. I had been fundamentally disrespected, having been lied to about my aunt showing up. My brother clearly had an agenda and was being manipulative. Right away, I knew Peter was right. After all, I had felt it myself, seeing my aunt suddenly appear from nowhere. I was crushed. I felt embarrassed falling into the same pattern again of being too attached to my family. My heart was sinking as I anticipated the outcome. I knew that Peter was advising me based on what was best for my soul. But how on earth was I going to call my brother and tell him that he and my aunt were disinvited? We had ended on such a good note. Other than the ambush, I had experienced quality time with them. How would I explain disinviting them to our Sunday service? Somewhere in my mind bounced a thought about how unchristian it seemed to disinvite someone to church. But I knew I had to. I knew I had fallen into the same trap of family again, and it was time to truly, finally let go. I prepared by making a prayer that Jesus give me clarity and unwavering strength. I went cold and dialed up my brother. My heart ached as he responded with confusion. My answers were decisive and definitive. I would not waver. I prayed for Mother Mary's comfort as I fell asleep that night, and I felt her presence holding my shivering heart. The next morning, I was so worried that Hanley and my aunt would show up to our Sunday service. Would I have to ask them to leave in front of others? But the morning came and went, and what seemed like a peaceful morning would become one of the worst days of my life. Mid-afternoon, I heard the doorbell to our novice house ring. At this point, I was a deacon in training. There were 2 priests at home and 1 novice. L, one of the priests, walked to the door and opened the little window cut out at eye level. I came out just in time to see my parents' faces through the window and Hanley's just behind them. They asked to see me. Well aware of all that had transpired the night and day before, L said no. My father tried to negotiate. He yelled beyond L and into the house, pleading for me to come out and speak with them. I retorted that I wouldn't, and then I turned around to quickly disappear into my room. I dropped to my knees and let the tears fall in torrents. I wept deeply as I heard their voices, desperate and scared. My body curled up on the floor next to my window. I heard my brother's voice outside as he went from window to window, saying, "Jen, we love you. Please come out. Please, we love you." A priest cuddled me in her arms. I could barely stand the pain. I could hear my father saying that they wouldn't leave, and then L threatened to call the police. It was traumatic and hit me to the core. I felt waves of conflicting feelings, betrayal, ferocious anger, devastation, understanding, compassion, grief. I knew that it was the end of an era and that there would be no reconciliation after this incident. If the pain of this experience alone wasn't enough for me to finally cut off my family, then surely my attachments would serve up a lesson for me that would be even worse. I resolved to cut my family off completely and not succumb to continuing to try with them. I would always have this incident to hold on to remind me of the deep pain that my attachment caused. Perhaps I was also setting my family free to live their lives and not think about me. I could feel and taste their hurt, and it was almost unbearable. I was exhausted. It had now been years that I had danced between loves, and it was time to pick a partner. I was causing too much pain. Many times I had been sucked back into my old ways, wanting to connect, wanting to share. But then with the help of my teachers, I'd be reminded of the futility in wanting love from people who could not give what Jesus and Mary could provide. In the clarifying light of my teachers, I would again realize how attached I was, and then I'd cause my family more pain by having to pull back again. To make God proud, I must whirl as a dervish and stop my tango with temptation. But my family would make one more big attempt to gain access to me. It would be the third and final time since my move to California. I would not speak to or hear from them for another 5 years. It was an ordinary day at work, and I was sitting in a conference room in a meeting with the owner of the company and about 7 other people. Suddenly, it seemed, I looked up at the door and my parents were standing there. I swiftly excused myself and ran down the stairs, knowing they would follow me. I stepped out of the building, and so did they. I was livid. How could they just show up? I felt so violated and angry. My father took the lead, and they begged me to just take a walk to a local coffee shop down the street and speak with them. I refused. I was very rattled, and as I tried to go back inside, my dad blocked the door. Another employee who was one of my novices had followed me to make sure I was okay. He opened the door and pulled me inside. It was physical and horribly dramatic. After this incident, Claire would put me in touch with a Scientology lawyer, and I would file a restraining order against my dad. I felt deep sadness about this, but I was also furious and felt that I had to stand up for myself, as Peter and Claire had encouraged me to do. For years to come, I would look around a parking lot before getting out of my car, worried that someone might be waiting to grab me as I got out. Years later, when my husband and I would move to New York and open the New York Center of Light, I felt as though I was being watched. This was a way that I also kept a sliver of blame alive toward my parents. It was something concrete that I could hold on to and have a valid reminder of why I wasn't in communication with them. Of course, deeper than this would remain the platform of truth upon which wisdom and love rest, where one cannot forget what's real and hope waits. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Project Hope podcast. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe and comment. You can always get in touch with me at jennifer-french.com. And please let me know any specific topics of interest. And of course, I'm always interested in your stories, whether you've left an organization of high demand, high control, or if you're an individual struggling with the knowing that someone you love is in such a situation. I am here for you. Think critically, take heart, and be free.